Hello friends, welcome back. Let us continue with another perspective to organizational change and development, that is transactional analysis. This is another tool that I am going to discuss about how to understand and bring change in the patterns of communication among team members in order to function effectively. In the previous session I talked about Johari window. Today I am going to talk about transactional analysis. This is another most popular tool that is being practiced in organizations and corporate sectors in order to improve communications and relationship among team members. So, what is transactional analysis? This was developed by Eric Berne to the world as a phenomenological approach, which is a philosophical study to the structure of experience and consciousness in the late 1950s. So, this tool as transactional analysis is completely related to an individual's personality and how an individual's personality influences the interaction between two people, and that interaction will define the relationship or the functioning of an individual's psyche. The point is that there are n number of conversations that goes on in an individual's psyche. Psyche means mind, and how those hidden conversations are reflected when an individual is physically interacting with the other person. So, according to the International Transaction Analysis Association, TA is a theory of personality and a systematic psychotherapy for personal growth and change. As I mentioned that there are n number of conversations that goes in an individual's psyche, in an individual's mind, and they are reflected in his communication patterns. So, the way the person communicates is actually reflecting his personality and how it is going to influence his process of personal growth and change. If the conversation is very positive, it has a different impact on an individual's relationship with the other person or vice versa. So, here TA, transaction analysis, is basically a theory of personality, and it is an outgrowth of Sigmund Freud's theory of personality. If the audiences have a little bit of background about psychology, Sigmund Freud is known as the father of psychology, and he is the first person to lay down the first theory of personality based on that how human mind reflects an individual's persona, and that persona is backed by individual's wishful desires, his fears, his issues, conflicts, or maybe past experiences. So, TA shifted the attention from internal psychological dynamics to the dynamics contained in people's interactions to solve emotional problem. So, whatever an individual has in his mind, it is reflected unconsciously related to his emotional problems or psychological problems are reflected in an individual's way of conversation with the other person. The more the person has positive experiences, the impact of positive experiences are reflected unconsciously in an individual's ways of communication. Therefore, transactional analysis explains that an individual's final emotional state is the result of the inner dialogue between different parts of the psyche. As I mentioned, there are different sections in the brain, in the mind, and there can be emotional problems, there can be some perceptual or thinking problems that goes in an individual's mind, and how he is interacting in his mind and is reflected in his way of communication or transactions. So, when we are talking about transaction analysis developed by Eric Berne, he has expanded Sigmund Freud's theory of personality in form of psychotherapy, that how these conversations can be used to understand relationship among others, and we can influence those interactions in order to be more effective. So, Berne mapped interpersonal relationships to the three ego states of the individuals, which are the parent, adult, and child states. These are the three ego states of an individual, that everybody functions with these states in every different situation. Right? Berne investigated communications between individuals based on the current state of each person, and he called these interpersonal interactions as transactions. So, whenever an individual is interacting with the other person, so two people who are engaged in transaction or communication is termed as transaction, that is the communication or the interaction, and the way the transaction will take place, in which direction. So, there can be different ways that two people are interacting and in which direction that the interaction will move on. He has labeled those interactions as games. which refers to certain patterns of transactions that popped up repeatedly in everyday life in every human interaction. So, whenever we are at workplaces, for example, when we communicate, we interact with the co-workers, the other co-worker will repeatedly pop up with some different and stable pattern of conversation. It can be very polite, it can be very erratic, or sometimes very conflicting as well. So, this is all influenced by the inner dialogue that is going on in an individual's mind, and he will pop up in day to day life in the similar fashion. So, basically Eric Berne has talked about the transactions in form of interactions that take place between two people and in which direction the transaction will move on, that is known as label. So, what are those ego states? Let us discuss about these ego states in detail. So, TA is considered as an outgrowth of Freudian id, ego and superego. He has divided human thinking into three layers: id, ego and superego, where id is something which is the most stimulating and instinctual part of personality, where it is instinctual and any individual would like to satisfy his needs, desires, any wishes in one go. There is no control and he is stimulated to satisfy those needs. Those needs can be biological in nature or it can be in any form, that I want to purchase a bike and I want to ride it to the highest speed. Ultimately, the person is stimulated to satisfy such kind of needs. So, these are the urges that has to be satisfied in one instance. There is no control, it is impulsive. This state is of human mind is impulsive. We are angry, we can just hit the person, there will be no control. So, this is impulsiveness. So, it is stimulating and impulsive. The other is ego, which deals about monitoring the behavior and testing the reality. We need to understand the rules and regulations of the society and then function accordingly, that what is acceptable in the society, and we tend to tune our own behavior in that direction. This is ego. It is actually the monitoring aspect or the reality checking of an individual behavior. And the other is superego, which talks about control and morality, which talks about the basic and higher principles, that what is right and wrong. It focuses on the moralistic aspect of an individual behavior. This was the classification of human mind given by Freud in his theory of personality, but Eric Berne used this theory of personality as a psychotherapy in order to understand relationships, right? And most importantly, the id, ego and superego are largely shaped by individuals' childhood experiences. So, the day the child takes birth and till his adulthood, whatever experiences goes on, those experiences are piled up and they are so much influential in an individual's life that they tend to control their mind based on those experiences, and those experiences will automatically influence the three states, that is id, ego and superego. But how Eric Berne has used this aspect of human personality in his own theory of psychotherapy, and he has transformed the id, ego and superego into a pack model, that is the parent, adult and child ego states, that how these ego states function when an individual is engaged in transaction with the other person. So, getting more into detail about id, ego and ego will help us to understand the pack model, that is the parent, adult and child ego states. So, let us just go more little bit detail into id, ego and superego. So, the id is the impulsive or the unconscious part of our psyche that responds directly and immediately to basic urges, needs and desires. It talks about the sexual desires, it talks about the biological desires, hunger, thirst, sleep. It can be anger, that there is no control on our anger and we become more aggressive. So, the personality of the newborn child is all id, and only later does it develop an ego and superego. So, any child will be very much controlled by the id. The child has no control, he has no understanding of the social rules and realities, and the child is stimulated enough to satisfy his own needs. So, the id engages in the primary process of thinking, which is primitive, illogical, irrational and fantasy oriented. Id has no understanding of the reality of the moralistic principles. So, he indulges in any kind of behavior and action which tend to satisfy his or her urges. This form of process thinking has no comprehension of objective reality and is selfish and wishful in nature. As I mentioned, that the id has no understanding of the social reality. So, when the id achieves its demands, we experience pleasure. It is so simple to understand that whenever any illogic, irrational desire is fulfilled, we experience pleasure. But once they are not satisfied, an individual will experience tension and he will engage in more other forms of behavior which are maybe aggressive or maybe they are very subtle. But still it dominates the human mind. The other is ego. Ego develops to mediate between the unrealistic id and the real external world. So, the ego will try to monitor the id in a way that if even if the id wants to satisfy his desires, no matter it is irrational, the ego will try to satisfy the id based on social reality or social rules and expectations. So, it is a decision making component of personality. So, when the ego is dominating, the person will engage in rational decision making, that every decision making should be as per social reality or rules. So, the ego's goal is to satisfy its demand in a safe and socially acceptable way. In contrast to the ego follows the reality principle as it operates in both the conscious and unconscious mind. So, id is unconscious and ego is conscious. It is working at the conscious level. We understand the environment and then taking any decision accordingly. So, even if ego is satisfying its desires, it is actually in the periphery of social expectations and reality, right. The other is superego. It is a moral component of of an human psyche, representing internalized social values and standards. Its contrast with its desires, guiding behavior towards moral righteousness and inducing guilt when standards are not met. So, it is over and above ego also, that is completely based on moral principles about right and wrong. The righteous pattern of behavior is more dominating. So, ultimately superego and ego are parallel to each other, where even when ego is satisfying its desire within social expectations, still superego will impose its own morality or the concept of righteousness in order to satisfy its desire. So, it also persuades the ego to turn to moralistic goals rather than simply realistic ones and strive for perfection. So, even superego controls ego. So, it is about that all the three states of the psyche, id, ego and superego, they are actually functioning in line, but they are trying to regulate each other. This is about Freud's concept of id, ego and superego. But how these concepts became outgrowth of Eric Burns in form of parent, adult and child ego state, that is the PAC model. So, what is parent ego state? The parent ego state is a result of messages people receive from their families, parents and elder people during their early childhood. The parent ego state of a person comprises the judgmental, rule making and moralizing component of personality, and it is expressed by advice, do's and don'ts. So, it is about the understanding the reality, understanding the social expectations and then functioning accordingly. So, it is about the basic education or training that we receive from our family, and it is reflected in our own transactions or communications in future. Adult ego state is authentic and reality based. It is rational, objective, fact seeking and problem solving, and it is directed towards the objective appraisal of reality. So, here adult ego state will collect all the information in a very physical and objective manner, compare all the pros and cons, and then only the action will be taken or then only the communication will be initiated, which can actually maintain balance, make the transaction more or communication more influential and effective. And the other is child ego state. This is equivalent to id, which constitutes the emotional, creative, impulsive and spontaneous component of personality, that there is no thought process involved and only about the action, which can be irrational, but most of the time it is creative also and impulsive. So, it is all related to id, ego and superego, but how these concepts of parent, adult and child ego state influences future communications backed by childhood experiences, that is more important to understand. Okay. The ego state was one component of transactional analysis. The other is transactions. Byrne investigated communications between individuals based on the current state of each person. He called these interpersonal interactions as transactions. So, any individual who is communicating with his co-worker, he is basically working or communicating based on his current state of his mind, that what situation he is into, and he will maintain that communication accordingly. So, that interaction is termed as transaction and is used as label games to refer to certain patterns of transactions that popped up repeatedly in everyday life in every human interaction. So, every person will communicate in his her current state, and how that current state will influence the communication with the other person, that is the game, because that current state will actually take the whole communication pattern in a different direction. Therefore, transaction is the basic unit of any social interaction, because current state of two individuals is functional. So, it is a basic unit of social interaction, and it consists of an exchange of words and behavior between two people. So, this use of words and behavior become game. How we are using the words and behavior in a particular construct in a particular current state. Therefore, TA identifies the ego states that both the initiator and the respondent exhibit in the transaction. So, the point is that whenever two people are communicating each other in their own respective current state, then in that current state both the people's current state are backed by the ego states, that is parent, adult and child ego state. We never know that A member in which current state, and he will initiate communication with which ego state, and we have no idea about B, that he is in which current state and he will communicate with which particular ego state. But as soon as the communication will start, the transaction between words and behavior decide what will be the game. So, what are those transactions, types of transactions that people indulge in? The first is complementary transaction. It is the most positive form of communication that takes place between two people, where the communication continues along parallel lines between individuals and the transaction is complementary. In this form of transactions, the communication is complete and both operate from their adult ego states. Now, adult ego state is the most rational state. For example, X and Y, they are two supervisors, or maybe one is supervisor and the other is the assembly line worker. So, X is operating with his adult ego state and Y is also operating with his adult ego state. That X would say how many units you have manufactured till now. Y as an assembly line worker would say, indulge in complementary transaction, that I have produced 50 units in an hour. So, that means both the individuals are working from their adult ego state in that particular situation, right. Or it can be C to C, that maybe two little girls are playing with each other and ultimately they are operating with their child ego states. So, this is about complementary transaction, that whenever two people are operating with adult ego states, the transaction will be complementary, because they are working with their adult ego state, right. The other is cross transaction. This transaction crosses or seizes and inhibits creativity and free thinking. This may lead to breakdowns in communication and may sometimes be followed by conflict. It is sometimes that one person is working with adult ego state, but maybe the another co-worker is engaging in communication with his child ego state. So, definitely there is a clash. So, the conversation will become crossed. For example, if a manager questions the assembly line workers that how many units you have produced till now, maybe the assembly line worker would communicate with his child ego state that this is none of your business, please come to me later on, I am busy right now. Now, definitely the manager who was already working at the adult ego state will also step down to certain extent to child ego state, and he will also respond to the assembly line worker with his child ego state that you cannot speak to me in this rude manner. Ultimately, the transaction, the game that has taken place between two people based on the communication, that becomes a game, because based on the exchange of words and communication and behavior, and it can lead to conflict or quarrel. So, this is something where two people are there in the communication, one is working with adult ego state and the other is working with the child ego state, and this leads to conflict or quarrel. Now, in order to avoid this cross transaction, the other person can also make another efforts in order to bring the person who is working with child ego state to an advanced level of adult ego state. For example, maybe the mother would tell his son or daughter that it is time to take your medicine. Maybe the son would say, it is bitter in taste, I will not have it. Definitely that child is working with his child ego state, right. Now, the mother can also just leave the son that okay, do not have it, but since the mother wants his son to take the medicine, maybe mother will again operate with his adult ego state that I know that it is bitter in taste, but if you will have it, you will feel better, and in the end you can have some sugar to enhance your taste. And ultimately the son will also raise his ego state from child to adult ego state, and he will consume the medicine. Under such kind of transaction, the game is something where the words and behaviors are taking in a positive direction and the transaction is complementary. Similarly, it happens in workplaces also that maybe the manager will again try to explain the whole situation, that why he is asking this question of how many units you have produced, and maybe while understanding the whole process, even the assembly line worker in some time will respond with his adult ego state. This is cross transaction, and the other is ulterior transaction. Ulterior transactions are even more complicated. In complementary and cross transaction, it is clear, right, that what the other person is reflecting in his communication. But when we talk about ulterior transaction, it is very complicated because it is covert and overt both. You have something on your face, but intention is hidden. So, ulterior transactions are even more complicated because there is an overt and covert message that is communicated simultaneously. The overt transaction is audibly spoken, what you are speaking to the other person can hear it, but the covert transaction is psychological message that is actually being communicated. The covert message is actually that psychological message which has the hidden message in it, which the other person has to try to understand the meaning. So, in essence, it is when people say one thing but mean another, that hope to see you soon. Maybe on the overt message is very positive, but maybe the covert message, the psychological message is that I do not want him to be there. So, this is about that when people say one thing but mean another. We all do it, and we can recall situations where we have indulged in this kind of transaction. So, the intentions are hidden and the person does not admit it. Maybe the person was not appraised to that level at workplaces. The co-worker would say, I am not happy that you are not appraised properly, but maybe hidden is that the person enjoyed that his appraisal has gone down. This is ulterior transaction, right. This is about transactions and the ego states that we have talked about transaction analysis. We will extend this discussion to another aspects of TA, that is strokes and light scripts. I will continue in the next session. That is all for today. Thank you so much.